Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Richard Piacentini, and I'm the President and CEO for Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens. And the title of the session you're in right now is called Leading by Example, Collections-Based Cultural Organizations Addressing Climate Change. I'd like to just go over some of the key points that I'd like to discuss with you today. First, I'd like to start off with a case study on Phipps Conservatory and talk a little bit about our journey to become more sustainable and how our understanding of sustainability evolved from a view of trying to be less bad to regenerative. I'd also like to talk a little bit about how regenerative thinking has completely changed the way we do things and give you some examples of how that is in action. I'd like to talk a little bit about climate change and recognizing this as the symptom or the problem, and then talk about transformational thinking, which is another word for regenerative thinking, as being a solution to climate change. I think it's also important that we change the story of what success looks like, and I would also talk about the importance of connecting people to nature and inspiring our visitors. Then I'd like to talk about the Climate Toolkit, which is a collaborative effort by several different cultural organizations to address climate change, and give you some examples of some of the things that these different organizations are doing to address climate change in a number of different areas, and then talk a little bit about how we're applying regenerative thinking with this toolkit. First, I'd like to start out and just give you a quick overview of Phipps and the history of Phipps. We're located in Pittsburgh in southwest Pennsylvania, which is in the northeastern part of the United States. The original conservatory was given to the people of Pittsburgh by Henry Phipps, who was one of Andrew Carney's partners in the steel business. And at that time, people thought there was no limit to the amount of pollution we could produce or natural resources we could use. In fact, people thought we were going to conquer nature. Unfortunately, now many of us realize that's not true. We're not going to conquer nature, and we have to completely change the way we interact with the world. But for that time, when Pittsburgh was a pretty smoky place back then, the conservatory actually turned out to be a really important place for people to connect to nature. It was clean, there was lots of beautiful flowers, and people flocked to the conservatory to really experience the beauty of nature. The city of Pittsburgh ran the conservatory for 100 years, and then in 1993, after steel collapsed in the region, they spun it off to a nonprofit organization or an NGO, and that's who I work for. One of the first things we realized that we needed to do was to continue this wonderful 100-year tradition of doing these spectacular flower shows for the people of Pittsburgh. But we also recognized that we needed to make some major changes to the conservatory. We needed to address things like some dilapidated facilities, and we needed to make the conservatory much more visitor-friendly. So we adopted a 3-phase master plan to make some major renovations of the conservatory. The first building that we attempted to renovate was the Welcome Center. And originally, when we built this facility, we were mostly focused on improving visitor amenities. But one of the architects we talked to at that time, and this was back in the late 1990s, he told us about this new thing coming out called LEED. And LEED is probably the most important standard, or the most prominent standard of green building certification in the United States. It stands for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And back in the late 1990s, it was just coming out. And he told us how buildings account for about 40% of the energy we use and the water we use and the pollution we produce. We had no idea. We said, we really care about the environment. Why shouldn't our buildings reflect our values? So we decided to pursue LEED certification for this building. And we really started to dig into it and really try to understand why was LEED asking us to do all these different things. And I remember walking down into the cafe one day when they were installing these gray tiles on the floor. And I noticed on one of the boxes it said made in Turkey on it, and I was really surprised because in LEED, you're supposed to use local materials. So we really should have been using something that was from somewhere in the United States. So I called up one of the people on the project and I said, why are we using tile from outside the United States. We're supposed to be using local materials to minimize the amount of energy it takes to transport heavy materials around the globe. And he said to me, we already got that point. I was really surprised. I said, you've got to be kidding me. We're not just doing this just to get the points, and then as soon as you check the box, you go back to doing things the old way. We're doing this because we think it's the right thing to do. And it was that one tile experience that really changed the whole trajectory of everything we started to do at the conservatory. All of a sudden, we start to ask all these questions on how can we do things that are better, whether or not we're going to get points or certified for them, whether or not that ever happened. So, for example, LEED said we had to use 20% renewable energy in the Welcome Center. We said, well, why stop at 20%? Let's do 100%. And then we said, why stop at the Welcome Center? Let's do our entire campus. So we switched over to 100% renewable energy. We started to do things like we switched our front lawn maintenance over to organic lawn care. We got rid of all the toxic pesticides. We started to go through every single thing that we were doing and start really trying to make it be much more sustainable, whether we got points or not. This even led to our doing things like several years later, we ran a lot of programs for children, and we care about children's health. We said it doesn't make sense to talk about children's health in our programs and serve a lot of junk food and soda in our cafes. So we stopped selling junk food and soda in our cafe. So you can see that the one tile really started to create this whole change in the mindset of how we were doing things. In 2006, the Welcome Center opened in March of 2005. In 2006, we opened our new production greenhouses, and originally we were told you can't get a greenhouse LEED certified because of all the glass, you'll never meet the energy requirements. But we decided to make them be as good as we can nevertheless. And then after we were finished, we decided to go back and get them certified because we thought we did a really good job with the construction of these greenhouses. And we ended up getting LEED Platinum, which is the highest level of certification you can get under the existing buildings program. And they were the first greenhouses ever to get LEED certified. Later that same year, we opened our new tropical forest conservatory. And in this conservatory, even though this is a giant south-facing glass wall, it never gets hotter inside than it does outside, and it's 100% passively cooled. It really is remarkable, and it has no greenhouse effect. It's one of the most energy-efficient conservatories in the world. By this time, we found ourselves thinking in systems, which is how nature works. And we really start to try to understand the relationships between people, plants, health, and planet. And around the same time, in late 2006, the Living Building Challenge was announced. Now, the Living Building Challenge is the most rigorous green building standard in the world. And it's the one that comes closest to regenerative thinking that I've ever seen. And I'll talk more about regenerative thinking in a little bit. But in this program envisions a society that is culturally rich, socially just, and ecologically restorative. And it has requirements like being zero energy and zero water. We decided to pursue this for our next building, our Education, Research, and Administration building called the Center for Sustainable Landscapes. And that building opened in December of 2012. And it met the Living Building Challenge. It's one of the first buildings to meet the Living Building Challenge. It was the first building to meet WELL Platinum certification, which is that's a certification that looks at how buildings affect human health. It met LEED Platinum, which is their highest level of certification, and Net Zero Energy certification. It was the first building in the world to get Sites Platinum certified, which is sort of like LEED for landscapes. And it was the first building in the United States to get BREEAM Outstanding for operations and maintenance. And it's also 3-star Fitwel certified, which is another measure of how buildings affect human health. It's one of the greenest buildings in the world, and it's still the only building in the world that has simultaneously met all of these certifications. Right after we opened that building, we started to look around for expanding our children's programming, an area for our children's programming. We needed to add a new classroom. And when we started to look around to see what other people were doing for classrooms, we were horrified to find out that in the United States, when most school districts need additional classroom space, they purchase portables. Portables are notorious for off-gas and a lot of toxic chemicals, which are not healthy places, and they're certainly not healthy places for children. It's really strange that children are most vulnerable members in society, and we tend to put them in some of the worst places. So we decided to see if we could develop a modular classroom that could meet the Living Building Challenge, and that building opened in April of 2015. Right after we opened that building, we decided we needed to renovate or to develop our new maintenance facility. Now, originally behind the conservatory, there was this old public works yard, and on it there was this old public works building. It was a cinder block building with no windows. And our original thought was to tear that building down and build something new. But then we said, one of the greenest buildings in the world is one that already exists. How about if we renovate this building to demonstrate that you can take an ugly old cinder block building and turn it into one of the greenest buildings in the world? And then we said, who else besides children usually gets crummy places to work? Well, it's maintenance people. What if we also pursued WELL Platinum certification, making this one of the healthiest buildings in the world for people to work? That building opened in June of 2018. And it has already achieved WELL Platinum certification, and it is very close to finishing up the certification process for the Living Building Challenge and LEED Platinum. Now, I mentioned regenerative, that the Living Building Challenge approached this idea of regenerative thinking. I'd like to talk a little bit more about regenerative thinking with you, because I think it's really key for our success in addressing things like climate change. And one of the best ways I've heard of describing regenerative thinking was through the work of Carol Sanford. And she talks about these 4 paradigms of how we can interact with the world. The first paradigm is called the extractive model. And the extractive model, the person who approaches the world from this point of view, sees the world as fragments there for the taking. It's all about them. As long as they get theirs, they're happy. This is actually how a lot of Western societies works, where we see the world as a place for extracting its resources with little consideration of what's going to happen to those resources, or what's going to happen to anything around the extraction of resources, what it's going to do to the rest of the planet or to other people. The next model is called the less bad model. And this model, people still see the world as fragments, but now they're trying to stabilize them. And it's not just about me anymore, it's about us. And we're starting to see some interconnectedness. We're trying to be less bad. This is where a good example of this type of paradigm is where the environmental movement started, where we tried to try to mitigate some of the damage we were doing to the planet. And you could think of the reduce, reuse, recycle as a good example of trying to be less bad. The third model is called the do-good model. And in the do-good model, a person in this model still sees the world as fragments, but now they're trying to improve them. And it's about us, and they're starting to see some reciprocity. You might think this is a really good model to follow. The problem with this model is the person who operates from this model sees what they think is good as something that everybody else should try to do, and they're trying to dictate what good looks like. And that's not really the best way to approach things. The last model is called a regenerative model. And in a regenerative model, you don't see the world as fragments. You see it as whole. And you see holes within holes, and all these holes are interconnected. It's systems thinking. It's how nature works. It's about us. And it's trying to understand all those interconnections and how everything you do affects everything else on the planet. And you try to understand those relationships and how can you improve those relationships. This is how a lot of indigenous people think. And this is the way we're trying to think at Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, in trying to apply this way of understanding these relationships and our role in the world, and try to make the world a better place for people and the planet. Now, to do that, we use, a lot of times we'll use some different frameworks to help explain or to help understand or to help improve the way we're doing our work. And one of the frameworks that we use is called 3 lines of work. And in 3 lines of work, one of the good way of looking at this is think of yourself in the center, or you're a worker in an organization. And the first thing you need to do is become proficient in what you're doing. When you try to approach the second line of work, you need to understand that you're not just a single individual in this organization. You're working with other people in this organization, in other departments. And together, all of these departments need to work together to to really maximize the goals of the organization. In the third line of work, you then say, okay, what is the role of the organization in the community? What can we be doing to have a greater impact and a positive impact on the community? So we're always trying to understand when we're doing things, not only what is the second line of work, but what is the ultimate goal of the community or the work that we could do to help make the community be a better place. And a good example of that is with our homegrown program. In Pittsburgh, there are a number of communities that are called food desert areas where there's no access to fresh food and no grocery stores. So because we have expertise in growing plants and organic vegetable gardening, we developed a program to go out into the community and to help and to build raised bed vegetable gardens in people's backyards, and then develop a program for over 2 years that will work with people to help them learn how to grow their own food organically. And then we continue to work with them after those 2 years on an as needed basis. And for the last 5 years, we've installed almost 350 vegetable gardens throughout this community. And it's turned out to be one of our most successful programs. And I think it's a really good representation of really trying to understand how can we be out in the community beyond just the organization and actually have a positive impact in the community. The next framework I'd like to share with you is called the Living System Stakeholders Framework. And in this framework, we recognize that we have 5 stakeholders. This is a framework that works for both businesses and any kind of nonprofit or non-governmental organization. One of our stakeholders is our investors. Investors would be in a for-private company, in an organization like Phipps, to our donors. We have our users, we have our community, we have our co-creators, which are all of our staff, and we have the planet Earth. In regenerative thinking, we try to add value to all 5 of those stakeholders. And when you look at most businesses and most organizations, they typically focus on either 1 or 2 or maybe 3 of those stakeholders. Obviously, they're going to care about their investors. They may care somewhat about their users, and maybe even some will actually do work in the community. But it's very rare to find an organization that tries to treat all 5 stakeholders equally and add value to all of those stakeholders. This is an example of regenerative thinking. This, again, is something we try to do when we're doing our work at Phipps. The next framework I'd like to share with you is called the Law of 3. And in the Law of 3, when an activating force comes up against a restraining force, the typical reaction is to compromise, and to see it as conflict and as compromise. And when you compromise, it means everybody loses something. So in regenerative thinking, when we have an activating force coming up against a restraining force, we try to see, is there a way to reconcile that conflict into reaching a greater potential? A good example of this at Phipps could be how we responded to the COVID pandemic. In March of 2020, we were forced to close down for 3 months. And a typical response, I think, from a lot of organizations was to immediately start laying staff off and shutting down their operations. We decided that we did not want to do that, and we wanted to continue to keep all of our staff employed. We didn't have work for them to do, so we found things for them to do. Obviously, because we're a botanical garden, we have live plant collections. We had to have some of our staff working in the gardens, socially distanced and as careful as we could to keep them safe, but a very minimal amount of staff on campus. We then had some of our staff members were able to work virtually, like in our exhibits and programs departments, they were able to do that work virtually. But for many of our staff, there wasn't really any work that they could be doing. So this gave us an opportunity to figure out how can we use this opportunity to start doing things that we just never had time to do before. So we had some of our staff, we started to have work on updating our databases. Some of our staff started working on putting our programs virtually so that we could have more people attend our classes. We had some people call, all of our 18,000 members. And we had some staff fulfilling their education credits. Other staff were assigned to getting our AAM accreditation, which is usually a several-year-long process that we're able to accomplish in a year. We also started to develop regenerative learning workshops for our managers so that when 3 months later, by the time we were able to reopen again, we were able to open on day 1 with an engaged and energized staff. And not only that, what we found is we were actually in a much stronger position than we were before the pandemic because we have all this additional work that we'd never been able to do before, and we were able to accomplish it. So again, I think this is a really good example of using regenerative thinking to maximize the capabilities of an organization. That same idea has gone into our developing a lot of programs out in the community. Typically, in the past, if you wanted to see Phipps, you had to come to the Conservatory. Now we have lots of different things that we can be doing out in the community. For us, it's been quite a journey. It's been a journey that's been developing. It's been a journey that's been taking us from this, working from this paradigm of less bad to do good to regenerative. Just a couple of key highlights that I'd like to share with you. In 2005, we switched to 100% renewable energy. In 2009, we stopped selling bottled water. In 2010, we started to offset all the carbon we produced to heat all of our buildings. In 2015, we divested from fossil fuel investments. And in 2017, we broadened that to a much more socially responsible investment policy. In 2018, we started to focus on reducing our single-use plastics. And in 2019, we switched to our cafe menu so that's more than 70% vegetarian and vegan. I forgot to mention another important one. In 2006, we stopped using any disposable serviceware in our cafe or anywhere else on campus as well. We're continuing to try to align our buildings and our programs and our operations with our values, and really continuously trying to explore the intersection between human and environmental health. You know, several years ago, I heard a statistic that said that if everyone on the planet were to try to live like we live in the United States, it would take 5 planets worth of resources to do that. Well, that's obviously not possible. What that means to me is that we need to think about better ways of living so that everyone on the planet can share in the limited amount of resources that we have in the world. And if you think about the way we're living right now, our unsustainable use of natural resources is leading to such things such as climate change, habitat destruction, and loss of biodiversity. But these are really not the problem. These are the symptom of the problem. The real problem is the lifestyles we lead, particularly in Western societies. We can say the same thing about human health. Certain problems like cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, in many cases are tied to the way we live. These are more symptoms of the problem. The real problem is the lifestyles we lead. But then in many Western countries, that is the Western way. We serve a lot of unhealthy food, a lot of junk food on plastic disposable serviceware. We don't really give it any other thought. We really need to make the transition and start recognizing how human and environmental health are totally interconnected. In October of 2018, the Stockholm Resilience Center put out a report for the Club of Rome called Transformation is Feasible. And the report was based on the idea of understanding that we have 17 goals, UN sustainability goals, and there was a lot of discussion about achieving these goals, but nobody ever really looked at how can we actually achieve these goals. So they decided to do a study, and they started to look at 4 different ways of how to try to achieve the UN sustainable goals, sustainable development goals. And the first model they looked at was called SANE, which was business as usual. The second model was called FASTER, where they said, okay, let's just ramp up our economic growth, and the more growth we have, the faster we can achieve the sustainable development goals. The third way they looked at was called HARDER, where they said, let's really just focus in on trying to get these sustainable development goals as best we can. And then the fourth model they looked at was called transformational. And they said, we're gonna have to stop trying to work from the paradigms that we're looking at, the way we do business right now, and really have bold transformational policies and way of doing business to really make this, to achieve the highest level of sustainability goals within the limits of the planet. And when they modeled those out to the year 2050. And what they found is um, the smarter or the transformational scenarios actually achieve the highest number of sustainable development goals. But what was really interesting is when they looked at what was the impact on the planet, they found that only the smarter or transformational scenarios actually kept us out of the safe zone for planetary distress. All of the others put us over the red line in planetary problems. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about transformation? Well, I think in a lot of ways, the regenerative way of thinking that I was talking about before is a transformational way of thinking, and it's a type of thinking that can lead us to a much better way of doing business. In transformation, our end goal is to, achieve a better place for the people and the planet. In the traditional way we do things right now is we think of profit as the end goal. Profit should be the means of getting to the end. So really using profit to make the planet a better place for people and the planet. We really need to develop a transformational way of doing things. We need to do it quickly, and we need to do it as fast as we can. Taking small steps is not going to get us anywhere, and it's going to actually be disastrous if all we do is continue to take small steps. And I think what's really important for us is that we need to show that it is possible to maximize human and environmental health. It is possible to create places that are good for people and good for the planet. I think this building, the Center for Sustainable Landscapes, is a really good demonstration of that. I think it's also important that we show people that good can be beautiful and that these kinds of buildings are actually something that we should be striving to achieve. I think that's something the environmental movement got wrong many, many years ago when we led people to believe that if you want it to be sustainable, you're going to have to give things up. You're going to be less comfortable. You might as well get used to it. You're going to be cold in the winter. You're going to be hot in the summer. In fact, you're going to be miserable. Well, nobody aspires to be miserable. We need to show people that's actually better, that if we can achieve buildings like this, working in this building is one of the most wonderful places to work. And it's actually something that's better for people and the planet. And I think this is the kind of message we need to show people, that what we're talking about is actually better than where they're at now. Now, I know in talking to a lot of people about building buildings like this, trying to adopt these kinds of ways of doing things, I hear a lot of people come up talk about obstacles and problems about why we can't do these things. One of the obstacles that always comes up is cost. Or one of the questions I always get is payback. I think we're using the wrong measures of success. We need to stop focusing on short-term measures of success and really start thinking long-term on what's the long-term impact of our actions. A good example is with the kind of building I discussed, the Living Building Challenge building, or a zero energy building. There was a study that was done by the David and Lucille Packard Foundation many years ago, but they looked at the difference in cost between a market rate building, which is a typical type of building, and the Living Building Challenge building, which is a zero energy building in addition to many other positive attributes. And they tried to look at what's the difference between the cost of those buildings in the short term, but then over the long term. And if you look at this chart in the blue circles, you can see the market rate building is a little bit cheaper than the Living Building Challenge building at the top of the screen. But if you carry out what the cost is of operating that building over the long term, you can see that when you start looking 30, 60, 100 years out from now, the Living Building Challenge building is going to be so much cheaper in the long run to operate than a market rate building. So this I think, is really important. We need to start getting away from this mindset of looking at everything in the short term and really understand what the long-term impact is going to be. Now, we built the Living Building Challenge building. I won't be here, 60, 100 years from now, but I know the people who come after me are going to have a much easier job running the organization with that building than if we had built a market rate building. And that's the kind of way I think we need to start thinking, that we need to be thinking what's the best in the long-term interest of the institution. So an institution that built the building in the lower part of the screen, the market rate building, over the next 100 years, they're going to have to raise almost $350 million to operate that building. For somebody who built a living building challenge building in the upper part of the screen, they're looking at $20 million. So I think it's much better. I would much rather see my organization, instead of having to raise $350 million a year to operate that building, $350 million over 100 years to operate that building, I'd much rather see them raise that money and use it for developing programs that are good for the community. That's the kind of thinking I think we need to be doing as we go forward. So where do we start with all of this? How do we start with this? Again, it's really important to, I think, start with connecting people with nature. That's the very first thing we need to start doing. And when you think about it, in many Western societies, we spend about 90% of our lives in buildings, to the point, and if we're lucky enough to have a window, we can't open it, to the point where we tend to think of vacation as a place you go to, nature is a place you go to when you're on vacation. And the fact is that nature is around us everywhere. We just need to stop, look, understand it, appreciate it, and connect with it, and realize how important nature is to us. And this is the problem we face today. This is how a lot of young people are actually exploring nature. It's our responsibility, and it's our best interest to recognize that we need to connect people to nature, especially young people to nature, and we need to help to seek and grow develop their capacity in everyone that we reach. We also need to recognize that when we start to lead by example, we want to start to model the types of behaviors that we want people to do. It's going to make it a lot easier for them to accept those challenges. And one of the things that we did recently at Phipps was we created something called a Green Power Drive. We use 100% renewable energy at Phipps. We want to share with people that that is something that they can do as well. So we made an agreement with a green electricity provider where we would sell them memberships to Phipps at a discount that they can use as incentives to encourage people to switch to green electricity. And it turned out to be a win-win-win situation for everyone. The green power supplier got new customers, we got new members, and the people who switched over to green electricity got green electricity, and they got a free membership to Phipps. As we started this program, though, we recognized that we were talking about tons of carbon dioxide. We recognized that nobody knows what a ton of carbon dioxide looks like. So we asked ourselves, how can we make this be much more accessible for people so that they can understand what the problem is? Well, the typical Pennsylvania household produces about 8 tons of carbon dioxide a year in powering their house. Well, that's the equivalent to the amount of carbon dioxide that's given off by burning 16 barrels of oil. So we lined our front walkway to demonstrate that this is the impact you're having on the world when you're powering your house with fossil fuel-based electricity. And that one action actually led to our actually developing a program that got over 5,500 households to switch to green electricity over the last several years. Now, and the other thing that's really important is for people is to understand that when you do something individually, collectively, if we can all start doing things, it can have a big impact. So we have this chart that shows in the very center, just superimposed over a picture of our campus, the very center dot, that little dot in blue, is what 1 barrel of oil would look like on our campus. If you look at the pink, that represents what 88,000 barrels of oil would look like if you lined them all up over our campus. That's the amount of oil that's not being burned to power those 5,500 homes each year. Very powerful way of showing that, collectively, when we do things, even as individuals, that we can start to have a big impact. We really need to think about harnessing the power of botanical gardens and museums to engage our audiences and recognizing the important things that we need to do and that they can do to address climate change. There are 2,500 botanic gardens in the world. We attract over 750 million people a year that visit our gardens. In the US, we have 17,500 museums that attract over 850 million people a year. And worldwide, there are more than 50,000 museums, which means we have the ability to impact over 1 billion people a year. And this is really important because museums and gardens are typically places where people go for inspiration and learning. And they're among the most trusted institutions by the public. This is a great opportunity to get people that are going to be receptive to learning new things about the ways that they can have a positive impact in addressing things like climate change and looking at the way their lifestyles are. It's within that in mind that we started to work with a number of other botanical gardens to create something called the Climate Toolkit. And the Climate Toolkit we developed for gardens, museums, and zoos as an opportunity to share, mentor, and learn from each other about aggressive ways to address climate change, and then use that as an opportunity to lead by example to inspire their members and their visitors. And to join the toolkit, all you have to do is be willing to share what you're doing, agree to be a mentor for anybody else who wants to learn from what you did, and then use this as an opportunity to learn from other gardens and museums about things that they can do as well. The toolkit now has 40 different museums and gardens that are working networking together to start to advance this way of thinking. I should point out, when we first developed the toolkit, we put out some very aggressive metrics or goals that we put out there that people had to try to achieve. And we had 18 different organizations join, and then it kind of it's held steady for a while. Last September, we recognized that we were approaching this from a do-good point of paradigm, that we were telling people what good looks like, and this is what they should be doing in their institutions. Last September, we decided to switch the focus of the toolkit to more represent a regenerative way of thinking. And the way we're approaching this now is we understand that every garden, every museum, every organization is unique, every community is unique, every region is unique, and each of these unique gardens or museums and regions and communities has different areas that they can best maximize for addressing climate change. So we're really now trying to help these organizations figure out what is the best way based on their unique conditions to address climate change, and then try to work to help them to aggressively address addressing climate change in their region. And we're also asking them to help us expand the ideas of the toolkit to things that we've never thought of. Since we launched that new phase in this September, we had an additional 22 organizations join in less than 2 months. We now have 40 different organizations representing 36 million annual visitors that have joined the toolkit. There are 9 different major areas represented on the toolkit, and 29 different areas within that where they can actually start to look at these are things that they can do to participate in the toolkit. And I'd just like to share with you now some of the different institutions and some of the things that they're doing to address some of these areas. So for example, in the energy category, we have the Anchorage Museum that has pledged that all their new buildings will be zero energy buildings by the year 2023. The California Indian Museum and Cultural Center has pledged to use 100% renewable energy by the end of this year. And the Morton Arboretum in Illinois has committed to having all their renovations reduce energy use by 25% by 2022. Now, you've noticed I've using some years like 2021, 22, 23. One of the things we believe in the toolkit is that we want to see action now, or within at least 1 or 2 years. We're not interested in 2030 or what you're planning to do in 2050. We're not interested in having people kick the can down the road to 2050. We want to see things that people are willing to do now. So they're limited to 2 years to list the things that you can do within the next 2 years. For water, the California Botanic Gardens is pledged to reduce their municipal water use by 25% by the year 2022. And the Montreal Botanic Garden is pledged to reduce their potable water for irrigation by 25% by 2023. For food service, the New York Botanic Garden has already converted 40% of their food service to vegetarian and vegan. And the North Carolina Botanical Garden is sourcing 10% of their food purchases within 100 miles. Under transportation, the San Diego's Botanical Garden has converted 25% of their vehicles to electric. And Horniman Museum and Gardens here in Great Britain has developed a program to incentivize sustainable visitor travel. For waste, the Science Museum in Minnesota has eliminated single-use plastic in their cafe and other areas of their organization. And the Green Bay Botanical Garden has eliminated the sale and use of bottled water on their campus. For landscapes and horticulture, the Key West Tropical Forest and Botanical Gardens has developed a program to support reforestation. And the Smithsonian Gardens in Washington, D.C. has 25% of their garden equipment has been converted to electric. For investments, the Norfolk Botanical Garden in Virginia has divested from fossil fuels, and the New York Botanical Garden has adopted a socially responsible investment program. For visitors, the Morton Arboretum has developed a program to assist visitors and switch into renewable energy. And the Oakland Zoo and Conservation Society in California is developing a program to educate their visitors on the importance of food choices that they'll have fully implemented by 2023. And for organizations doing research, an example is the Santa Barbara Botanic Garden in California, which has developed a program for climate-specific research relative to their region. The Climate Toolkit we've also developed a webinar series to share different ways that people are addressing climate change in their organizations with other organizations. Our next webinar is coming up in December of 2021. We've also developed a blog and a number of resources that are available on the website for people to use. Currently, we're piloting a new youth advisory committee at Phipps Conservatory, where we want to engage youth in addressing climate change and having them help us develop new challenges for the toolkit that we think could be important in our community. We're also looking to share this model with other members of the toolkit to develop youth advisory committees in their regions, and then eventually hope to link all of the youth groups together through the toolkit so that they can begin to share different ideas with each other. I think the really important thing to understand here is that change can happen if we want it to happen. It's important that we recognize that being less bad isn't good enough anymore, that we really need bold transformational thinking, which requires us to think regeneratively. And I think it's also important to recognize that cultural organizations, because of the role that they play in our communities, because they're trusted organizations in their communities, because there's billions of people that visit these organizations each year, they can play a very important role in addressing climate change when they begin to lead by example and to share those opportunities with their visitors. For us at Phipps, I think it's remarkable when I look back, when I see from 1893, I see what a change and what a contrast. In 1893, we had one of probably the best examples of the worst kinds of buildings you could possibly build, a single pane glass house designed to grow tropical plants in a temperate climate. And here we are over 125 years later in 2021, and we have 3 of the greenest buildings in the world. Both sets of buildings connect us to nature, but it's only the latter ones that recognize that we're part of nature, we're connected to nature, and we need to live in harmony with nature. That, I think, is an opportunity that all of us can share and achieve and aspire to, is to create places that connect us with nature, create places that recognize the important connections between people, human and environmental health, and to recognize that we can create a planet that's good for everyone and everything else on the planet. when we start to think regeneratively and we start to change the way we think about how we interact with the world. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
We do have one question, and
Yes.
that is, what are the best ways local and federal government can support work being done by botanical gardens in combating climate change?
Well, I think one of the first things the government can do is to recognize the connections that we can have with so many different people, that we can share a lot of the initiatives that they want to have out there with people. I think, you know, government, in order for government to do things, you know, taking this top-down approach, it really requires a groundswell of support to be successful. And I think botanical, other cultural organizations can help provide that groundswell of support for making bold initiatives to address climate change when people can become educated and understand the impacts of climate change and how important it is to address climate change. I think cultural organizations can help do that. And I think working with the federal government can open up a lot of different opportunities to expand upon that.
Great. And we ask our audience that if there's any other questions, please put them in either the YouTube live stream chat or the Zoom chat.
I just put some different references up here. You can go to climatetoolkit.org if you'd like to learn more about the toolkit. I did a TEDx presentation that is similar to the program that you saw today. If you go to ted.com, just type in my last name and that'll show up. We have a brochure that's available on our website called Green Healthy Spaces, which talks about some of the work we're doing to demonstrate how to create places that are healthy for people and the planet. And also there's a further description of the Green Power Drive program available on our website as well.
Great. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So if you'd like to wrap up, that would be wonderful.
Okay, well, thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for joining us today. And I look forward to, working all of